We're here with Nicole, also known as Coco or Prusy, depending on what circles you're running in. She's a friend of mine. Nicole, why don't you introduce yourself? Where did you come from, and where are you, and how did you get there?
Oh my gosh. So I grew up outside of Manhattan, about 20 minutes away from New York City, in a progressive but privileged town in New Jersey. I was fascinated with Brits from pretty much the time that I was 6 or 7 years old, when we had an au pair. And 16 years ago, I moved to London, where I have been working in advertising technology. And about 6 years ago, I started coming to Croatia on holidays, cycling, etc. And in November of last year, 2020, I decided to leave my job, come out to Croatia, and get temporary residency. So at this very present moment, I am in Croatia, unemployed, and shuttling back and forth between here and London.
Oh, that sounds terrible. Poor you.
It's awful. It's
awful.
It's really tough. Yeah, as you can see, it's an awful place to be.
Yeah, don't know how you stand it. So have you got Croatian citizenship already?
I have temporary residency. So basically, I do have British citizenship. And, before we left the EU at the end of last year, we were still entitled to apply for residency in Croatia as EU nationals. So again, when I left my job in November, there was about 6 weeks that I could actually take advantage of that. And I kind of just jumped on it because I didn't know where I was going next.
Exactly. Yeah. Options, right? Yeah.
Yes.
And so you acquired your British citizenship through living in the UK for X number of years, and then you can apply and you get it. Is that how it works?
Yeah, I stayed long enough that they decided they weren't going to get rid of me. So they just gave me what used to be the red book, which is now the blue book. So now I have 2 blue passports. But yeah, I've actually been a British citizen for 10 years now.
Really?
Yeah, I know, right?
Because so when we were hanging out,
living there.
Yeah, when we were hanging out in London, because when did you move there? 2004, 2005?
2005. Yep.
Yeah, because I moved there in 2004, and we were introduced by Josh, and that's when we started hanging out.
We were introduced before I moved there, because I would go over there regularly from New York.
Oh yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah, so we've known each other longer.
And okay, so you were a resident in the UK long enough. You got your citizenship. Now EU is no more, and now you're going for this some sort of residency in Croatia, which is part of the EU, right?
Yes. So okay. Croatia is part of the EU, although we still have a separate currency, so that's fun. Shuttling back and forth between kunas and sterling still.
Do you exchange cash, or do you actually just use credit cards or electronic money mostly?
So I actually get dinged by my friends here quite a bit for never having cash, because it is very much a cash-based society still.
I miss that.
General purchases and stuff, I go around with my phone tapping and whatever, but I always carry a little change purse for restaurants and whatever like that.
So why did you pick Croatia after the UK?
So I came to Croatia 6 years ago. One of my best friends and I were going on cycling trips every year, and we had been to some crazy places like Jordan and Cuba, and just the way that our schedules were lining up at the time, we're like, all right, we can't do this kind of monster big trip this year. Let's just keep it easy. And Croatia was kind of becoming more popular. We saw this trip, the dates worked, and we just decided to go. And that was it. I hook, line, and sinker, fell for the place. It's, if you've never been here, it's a really just charming, beautiful, just amazing place that, it's become a lot more popular in the last 6 years since I've been spending time here. But it just felt very authentic and charming. And it's beautiful.
So
And that's the background that you have behind you in your.
This is Split in the background. Yep.
that's so pretty. So I've heard a lot of Australians coming home from London because they said that is not where you want to be stuck in a pandemic in a very, very small apartment. With your partner who you loved, but they're very close to you. So I've heard Split's a good place to spend a pandemic. Would you agree?
Oh my gosh, absolutely. And it's funny because there's actually a huge Croatian diaspora in Australia, and therefore there's a lot of Aussies in Croatia.
Mhm.
So my like girl gang here is primarily Aussies and Kiwis. But yeah, in terms of your question about where to spend a pandemic, absolutely. Like, I mean, I live in my flat by myself, so it wasn't that kind of same, oh my God, if I see this person for one more minute, I'm going to kill them.
Yeah.
But it was still the same four walls for, a while in London. And, I came to Croatia when they kind of opened up travel over the summer of the pandemic. And I was like, oh my God, air, it's just like,
So nice.
there was space, people weren't on top of each other. And that's been the case throughout. So that's what kind of prompted me to spend a lot of the time here this year, even though the restrictions and stuff have been easing in London. It's still this like, just freedom of space here. And it's, I this morning got up and I took an hour and a half walk up the mountain behind my house and, took in the sea views, etc. And I'm on my bike or down the beach or whatever. So it's a great place to be when you need to break the confines of your urban habitat.
I totally understand that. I was in Seattle when it all broke out last year in March, and I got to the point where I can't do that. Need to come home. So I came home to Brisbane, where it's the same thing. We've been allowed to wander around without masks, and it's a different pandemic to what everybody else is experiencing. I'm really lucky that we have the choice, right, to choose that.
Absolutely.
Cool.
I agree.
I want to visit now. Sorry.
Is that Brisbane behind you?
Yes, that is Brisbane behind me. I wish that was my view, but that's just a picture. My view isn't that bad, but that's Brisbane behind me. And it was 31 degrees today, and it was 13 Celsius in Melbourne, and they were all crying. And I'm like, I'll send you a jar of sunshine. I'm very thoughtful like that. So sorry, Jim, you had a question?
No, keep going.
Okay, so I have a lot of questions. I really want to know what Croatian food is, because I have starchy dumpling type meaty stew dishes in my brain, but I know nothing about Croatia.
So one thing to know is that Split, and where I spend my time, is part of Dalmatia. And so the food in Dalmatia is very seafood oriented. There's thousands of miles of coastline, billions of islands, and we're just across the Adriatic from Italy. So there's a lot of heavy Italian influence on the food here. So there's a lot of pastas, risottos, a lot of grilled meats, a lot of grilled fish, of course. But what's been really interesting is in the past 6 years, seeing new restaurants open up in Split. So as it's become a more tourist destination, the typical restaurants in Croatia are called Konoba. I'm not even sure if I'm saying that right after 6 years, but Konoba. And that's basically like a tavern. And you can go to any Konoba and it's going to be the exact same food. It's going to be grilled flesh of some description with some offering of salad, which is basically lettuce and, red wine vinegar and oil, and, potatoes and maybe blitva. Blitva is a very traditional thing, which is Swiss chard. So Swiss chard and potatoes is a really common side dish. Also peka, which is basically cooked. It's called cooked under the bell. So it's like a barbecue, but not like an Australian barbecue, like a stone barbecue where they cook the meat slowly over with this bell-shaped pot over it. And octopus peka is the super famous thing.
Oh,
now the problem is I don't like pretty much any of it because I'm the world's fussiest eater. But I think, a lot of people are like you, really surprised to find that it's not all big, heavy, starchy stuff. It is very substantial food, but it's very meat oriented in a lot of ways.
So you cook for yourself mainly? I mean, I've heard there's good produce there.
No, I don't know. I mean, I know how to cook. Okay. So my mother writes cookbooks for a living, and I'm the world's fussiest eater. I mean, there's, you know, if you want to do a psychology podcast, that's probably a good
I was about to say.
but, you know, of course, she thinks I do it deliberately to like spite her, but she'll also admit that I have like one of the most sophisticated palates of anyone she knows. So she's even so much as suggested that I could be a super taster, which I don't know. So I do love good food and I do appreciate good food, but I'm very specific about the food I like. And I also hate to cook. So it can be a bit of a challenge here. But like I said, you know, in the past few years, there's been a lot more options in terms of a little bit broader palette coming into the Croatian, you know, bigger cities, so Zagreb and Split. And then also on the back of the pandemic, the whole food delivery thing just exploded, which is woohoo. Although there's a lot of pizza delivery.
That's awesome. Well, you're alive, so obviously you found a way to eat. I'm just glad.
Yes. No, I mean, I'm definitely, I'm scrappy if nothing else.
Yeah, you survive.
Yeah.
What's so let's food is a big part of this, and I'm sure we'll get back to the food, but I'm more curious about things like culture shocks. I mean, I know you had some admiration for English because of your au pair, but then, you know, you get on a plane, like, you know, I've been to Italy with you once, and like, but when you go to these places, when you've lived in these places, what are the culture shocks? Things that are like, oh, I wasn't prepared for that.
I mean, I think, you know, the UK, and again, because I've been living there for so long now, it's like the shocks have kind of worn off. But like when I first moved over there, I did my year abroad when I was at, you know, college. I did my junior year abroad in a town called Bristol in the UK. And like things like having to put coins in a heater to get heat. You know, we live in America. You flip on the heat when it's cold, and you know, you don't think about, like, you know, the cost of it doesn't even register because you're just going to be warm. So, you know, I showed up to Bristol with, I don't know, probably more clothing than any of my flatmates had in their entire wardrobe. And that was just my kind of, you know, first semester abroad kind of requirements. So I think the biggest culture shock, and it's something that has really kind of reframed the way that I look at the world, is, you know, how, in a lot of ways, how we live with a lot of excess when we come from the US. And even those of us who are, I mean, I come from a privileged background, but, you know, even in less privileged circumstances, what we consider to be table stakes in the US was far beyond what was kind of basics in the UK. So I think that was a really big culture shock, just, you know, living there. You know, when I moved there, stores weren't open on Sundays. That was a culture shock, right? Like, you know, I woke up hungover one Sunday morning and I went out to go get, you know, some cereal and a Coca-Cola, and supermarkets aren't open on a Sunday. Now that has all changed a lot. And I think, you know, one of the things that I have noticed is in the 16 years of actually living there is, you know, the differences between the UK and the US have diminished greatly. I will say that, you know, there is still some of that stiff upper lip and kind of like just roll with it, like don't complain about everything. That was a big thing to me, was, you know, being very vociferous American, people being like, just deal with it, like don't make a big deal, you know. So I think there's still some of that. I'm conscious of it now. But it's actually really surprising how much the UK and the US are you know, coming together.
Is that London or all of the UK?
That's a good question. That's actually a great question. And if you want to put it on that parallel, it's London and New York versus, you know, the UK and the US. I haven't spent much time outside of, you know, large urban centers in the US. I mean, I've always lived in a large urban center. I spend time, for example, my best friend, she has a house in the Adirondacks. And so I go up there for like a week for holidays, but that's not really enough interaction to understand the difference. I mean, I see the difference on a very surface level, but same point. I don't go off to like, you know, Hull on a regular basis or something, you know. So I'm kind of, I'm in Bath, or I'm in London, or, you know, just visiting smaller towns outside.
What about Croatia? Like, what are the culture shocks there?
That's a little different. You know, the culture shocks are very much, you know, first of all, I was totally surprised by how many people do speak English here. You know, you wouldn't think that that would be the case, but actually, because something like 80% of their, you know, total country revenue comes from tourism, a lot of people are well versed in speaking English. However, you then take that for granted. So you go out somewhere to like some of the islands or some of the more rural towns, and you're just like trying to speak English, and people are like, no. But the general feeling here is people are very friendly, like they'll try. So, you know, you go to some places, I'm not going to call them out specifically, but, you know, some places have a reputation for like, they just hate tourists or hate strangers, or if you don't speak the language, they're not going to talk to you. Croatia is very open. It is a very masculine dominated culture still.
I've heard.
Yeah, it's you know, there are lots of strapping, you know, 6 feet tall men around, and there's a very masculine kind of slant to the culture. But you know, it's changing. And I think that the one thing that is a culture shock, which is kind of more like a nostalgic thing, is the way that they appreciate family. Like, I mean, you can have all your manly men, but they're going to go home to mama for lunch on Sunday. You know, family is incredibly important here, like culture, family, identity. And I think that it's really nice to see, like, you can walk down, you know, the main waterfront, and you'll see like a group of guys sitting there, you know, just shooting the shit every single day. And it's just it's just a little heartwarming to like watch them just, you know, they're not all kind of inside watching telly or whatever. They're sitting there, and, you know, if you have coffee, you have coffee for 3 hours, and you're, you know, just talking. So I think that kind of family orientation, and how small some of the towns are as well. So I think, you know, in the beginning, we talked about, oh, there's a common connection, possibly. Maybe I hadn't met this person, but if I heard their name, I probably know them. So, I mean, and that has happened to me a lot here. So the shock of like, oh, you know, so-and-so, like, for example, when I was looking for a house, a friend of mine was like talking to a friend of hers, and she was saying, oh, like, I have an American friend who's looking to buy a house. And she goes, oh, I know her. She's like from New York, right? And I showed her this house, like, and it's like, okay. So that kind of small town feel is a bit of a culture shock. And again, I'm not sure that that answers the question in the respect of Croatia versus, you know, small town versus big town. Like, what is the rest of the UK or the rest of the US like? But Croatia very much, even in its biggest cities, feels, you know, like a very close community, small town community.
Yeah.
That's awesome. That's really cool. Can I wind it back a bit? So, you know, we're talking about the masculine men, and, you know, I'm guessing the women take on the very female roles there as well. I always ask, because a friend asked me to ask a few episodes ago, what it's like to date when you learned to date in America, and then you went to the UK and you know, Croatia, like, what's the difference? Like, what was shocking? What did you learn?
So I don't really have a dating perspective in Croatia. I haven't gone there. To be honest, it's kind of funny because, again, with like the family orientation and, you know, focus on the sort of small town family aspect of things, a lot of the guys my age are married, and it's a very Catholic country, and there's not a lot of divorce. So, you know, I would be fishing from a very small pool, and that pool would be largely expat. So I haven't, you know, that's not really how I invest my time in Croatia. I have some friends who, you know, that there's a lot of Tinder and stuff like that, and a lot of the people on that tend to be passerbys, you know, people who are passing through town. And that's my secondhand experience of Croatian dating scene. But what I will say about dating in the UK versus dating in the US is that one of the really most interesting things is that in the UK, it feels like you don't date, you know, you kind of, there's like, you're kind of like, see, I mean, I think that's changed obviously in the last few years with things like Match and all those other apps and the dating apps. Like, the dating thing is a little bit more of a thing now, but it used to be like you kind of went out with somebody and then all of a sudden you were in a relationship with them. Whereas in the US, like dating, like kind of, and again, a lot of my US perspective is based on my experience in New York, but like that, the Sex and the City thing, like you meet somebody, you're out with your friends, like you're all out with your friends and you mix and meet. So I think that the dating scene has changed a lot in the UK, and people tend to date a bit more now, like using these apps and stuff. But yeah, I think that's probably the biggest difference. And one of the other most interesting things to me in the UK is that in the US, and again, I don't know how it is now, but it used to be kind of taboo for women and men to be friends without there being any underlying romantic notion. Like I don't know many guy friends that I have in the US that I became friends with them first, and then I became friends with their partners, or their wives or whatever. Whereas in the UK, I have a good number of guy friends who I subsequently become friends with their wives, girlfriends, partners, whatever. So, and it was never seen as untoward, like that. There was just a trust there that it's like, yeah, guys and girls can be friends. So that was.
I'm just replaying like my whole time in the US and wondering if I have any guy friends who are Americans who I got to know their wives. I don't think I did. I think they were all expats and their wives were American, but wow, yeah. I think you just opened my eyes. Now I'm going to be thinking about that for a week.
Well, like Jim and I mean, he's, I don't know how much Jim wants to share about his personal life, but obviously he's got a partner, and like, I've been friends with him since well before that, and well after that. So, it just never felt like a thing,
Yeah, same here. Yeah. Like Jim and I have been friends forever as just friends.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's very different outside the US. Like I don't feel like I have to be on my guard about talking to someone of the opposite sex. And also too, I think there's this, and it probably goes both ways, but I don't feel like there's an anxiety, not just with anybody I'm with, but also, does this person think that I'm interested in just by talking to them? Because it's like, which sets up the tone of every conversation in the completely the wrong way. Whereas now I just walk up to most people and just like, hey, what's going on? How are you? What's your name? I don't really want to be interested in you. I just want to, in terms of like sexually or dating, I just want to know you as a person. Yeah. And that flipped when I left the US. Which it's like that now.
That does kind of come back to the way that people date, right? Like in the US, like I think that there's this, if a woman or a man approaches you kind of out of context, the assumption is that it's a flirtatious or romantic approach, whereas that's not the way that it's. That's, and it's not to say that people in the UK don't misbehave and don't have untoward intentions, but it's usually pretty clear when that's the case, whereas the default is to just assume that it's a friendly approach as opposed to something else.
Yeah. Even thinking about who I was before I left, I could easily interpret a woman just approaching me and talking to me that she was interested in me, rather than actually this person just wants to say hi and talk to somebody. It has nothing to do with anything else. Yeah. And we're fed that from a very young age in America, I think.
I agree. And I think, I think that that's why I say it kind of goes back to the dating. And then even before that, which is how we're raised to think about dating.
Yeah. I want to switch the subject a bit. So when I'm talking to Americans, I really want to ask everyone this question. What is your feeling about other Americans' views of American expats?
So what is my feeling about other Americans?
Sorry, what is your perception? What do you think other Americans think of American expats?
Well, it's funny because a lot of other Americans that I know are American expats.
Well, no, sorry, but the ones back in America, right?
No, I think it, and again, like, let's frame this with the fact that I grew up in New York, and I grew up in a very progressive town, and that, a lot of the people who I socialize with in my industry, in my, childhood, etc., have a more global view. So it's not, it's not like the weirdest or worst thing ever. I don't have a close group of friends who feel that like I've betrayed America because I've left.
Yeah.
You know, most of the people I know either had the reaction of like, oh, that's cool. Like, what are you doing in London? Or like, how long have you been there? Or like, man, that's awesome. You know, I wish I did something like that. So I don't have that kind of antagonistic reaction. And also just in terms of like, you know, I was brought up in a house where my mother wanted us to know the world. I mean, she had lived in Paris on and off for 8 years. She studied cooking in Paris. She studied fashion in Paris. She had friends from all over the world and, you know, wanted them to come to our homes. You know, we had my brother's boarding school roommate and his family come over from Japan one Thanksgiving. And, you know, she always wanted us to be exposed to the food and the culture though. And so we were encouraged to travel. And so I think that, you know, when I left to go to the UK, my mom wasn't like, why? You know, I think she, you know, she had been seen as an exception when she did that in the 60s. You know, that was not what the rest of her siblings were doing at that time. But it meant that for me, you know, that was, you know, there was no problem with that. And my brother was already living in Germany at the time. So, you know, it's just that, again, if I look at my circle, there's not a lot of negativity or suspicion around that.
I'm the 50-50 because I'm from the Midwest where you know, some of the population, particularly women, are like, oh, that's great. I love it. Guys, a bit of a mixed bag where, you know, some guy thinks that I don't love America. And I'm like, hey man, I talk about America everywhere I go. Like I'm an ambassador for America. But I've also got those people that are like, oh, you think you know so much because you've traveled. And I'm like, I've just got a bit more experience. Doesn't mean I'm more smarter than you, but people can really put you on your back foot in certain conversations around. So I'm almost, when I walk into conversations back home, if I haven't spoken to the person in a while, I'm a bit guarded about it. And I feel like I need to be because, you know, they either think I'm rich or I work for the CIA. Like it's just ridiculous.
I'd go with the latter.
Exactly. I mean, you know, and I get that, right? Like I knew when you were asking the question, what was kind of driving that, because I do have other friends, you know, I have one of my good friends here is American from Texas, and she's been here for, you know, 8 or 9 years. And so obviously in Texas, that's a lot more of an anomaly than New York City, right? So I kind of understood what the angle was there, but in terms of personal experience, I haven't had to deal with that negative aspect as much.
That's interesting. Since you've been asking that question, Jim, I've been thinking about it from an Australian point of view, and it's a different reaction. Australians who've never, ever either left the country or been to the US love to tell me what the US is like. They explain it to me. They tell me what the US is like, and I'm like, I just came from there a month ago. Like it's not like that. And they'll sit down and just keep schooling me on it. So it's a different
That's Americans that have never been abroad.
It's Australians, man. And even if they've been there once, like, well, it was like this. And I went for 2 weeks to Disneyland. And I'm like, that's not, first of all, no.
That's most Americans who've never traveled. They have an opinion about everywhere else in the world, but they hate it when anybody has a critical opinion of them. It's one of the things that as time has progressed, I've learned to dislike as much as possible. That double standard or hypocrisy around that drives me nuts. So
okay, so let's go into stereotypes then. This is one thing we talk about. Are there stereotypes about the US that you hear that you have to correct in both the places you've lived?
Yeah, I mean, so certainly in the UK, there's a lot of stereotypes about the US, but they tend to be more acknowledged as being stereotypes. So, for example, when I first came to study at Bristol, I don't remember what the conversation was, but I was sitting around the table with my 4 flatmates at the time, and bear in mind, this is like 1993. And somebody said something about Oprah. I was like, oh my God, Oprah's the best. And still to this day, my flatmates will say to me, "Oh my God, Oprah's the best." Like when they want to take the piss, and be like this kind of like wide-eyed optimism of America. And I think that everybody's just happy all the time. And then, again, the sort of stereotype of being a complainer or being loud, which I happen to be loud, so that's not necessarily a stereotype. But I mean, it's just becoming conscious of these things. And actually, I think that in Croatia, things are different because you don't have as many, say, Americans living here. And the people who come from America, I mean, they make my skin crawl sometimes. So, bad behavior, like, again, this is a Catholic country. You see people, and not just Americans, but a lot of tourists, like not respecting the fact that this is an old culture that's changing slowly. So, you don't just wear your thong up from the beach and, nip up to the corner store. You put your clothes on and you do that. I mean, to the point where they've had to put signs around town saying like, no swimsuits in town. Like, so
Yep.
I do think that the behavior of Americans in Croatia can often be not the best representation of what Americans are like.
Yep.
But equally, they have a very good reputation for being generous because, the
Yep.
service culture, and, Croatia has an incredible service culture in terms of hospitality and everything else. And, tips or compensation for that are expected, but a lot of other foreigners don't necessarily have that same experience as, say, the Americans do. So in that respect, Americans are the most desirable guests in town because people know that they'll work hard and it'll be worth it.
Mm-hmm.
I would say Americans tend to not put much effort into understanding the culture or anything about the language or anything when they go to different countries. They're very, and I don't think I'm being stereotyping. I think that's an accurate assessment of how Americans travel.
I think that's true.
It's whereas, and it probably leads to it relates to the fact that less than 10% of Americans have passports, but it's like 30 or 40% of Australians have a passport. So they've at least been to a few places. Maybe they've been just in Bali, but like it's about I think the number of people within a population that travel and how that trickles down and how they educate you on how to travel and what I don't know, I could be wrong, but Damana, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, you still get disrespectful Australians, but I wouldn't
there's some
say
loud, obnoxious ones.
Yeah, I mean, they're usually the drunk ones. I would always be like, hear drunken tourists and be like, oh, it's Australians. It's always Australians. Yeah, I think that the fact that people are exposed to a lot more cultures in Australia, like it is multicultural, and you do know people from different places. And we talk about travel a lot, and a huge part of our, I guess our business is tourism here. So I think there's more of an understanding of that. Everyone lives in like tourist cities as well. So you understand there's different cultures. So I think it's normal for us to pick up a book, it used to be Lonely Planet, and read about like what you do and how you behave. And that's part of the culture. So yeah, I think they do travel well. Yeah.
I have actually a slightly different angle on this as well, which is, yes, Jem, your point is that only 10% of Americans, whatever, have passports. The other thing as well is time. It's very typical, even to this day, and particularly for younger travelers or younger, people in the workforce, to have 2 weeks holiday. So, if they're zooming over for a 5-day trip, then, maybe taking the time to read the whole history and, learning a few key phrases isn't as valuable as, if you're going to come for 2 weeks and travel around, for example. Or
that's a fair point.
And I do think that the other thing that you see is, again, with Americans coming to Europe, it's like, well, this is our big trip. So we got to hit like 2 days in Croatia, 2 days in Italy, 2 days in France. And so even, if they're away for 2 weeks, like they're trying to get as much as they can into a very, very compressed amount of time off. So I really do think that adds to it, because a lot of my friends in the UK, and I think a lot of people in Australia and some other countries as well around Europe, they take gap years. Like they take time to understand, what it's like to travel without a 2-week limit.
And we all
Yeah.
went backpacking. It was just the thing you did. Everyone went backpacking in their like early 20s.
Yeah.
Everyone.
Exactly.
And
that's
backpacking
so
is
culturally unacceptable in Europe. I mean, in America, except for the 2 weeks, right? Like you're
I
allowed.
don't, yeah. I don't know
when
anybody.
you graduate from college, you're allowed maybe 2 weeks or a month to go backpacking, but then you're expected to get back into it to get a job. I mean, like as a cultural phenomenon, taking time off to go backpacking for a year, not a big thing in the US.
And, well, and the people that do go backpacking, it's generally for a month or two, like you say. I don't know anybody. Like I've heard of, teachers from high school in the 60s, early 70s. They would go for like 6 months or a year, and they go backpack through Europe. Nobody talks about that anymore. Like it's usually just a fly over, fly out. I call it blitzkrieg tourism. You like you said, 2 days in Berlin, 2 days in Paris, 2 days in Barcelona, and then they fly back home.
Yep.
And whereas I'm very much the opposite. Like if I've only got a week, I'm like, I'm going to one place, I'm going to sit there and I'm going to soak it up.
Totally.
Everything about it, I can figure it out. But I'm also in a fortunate position where I've learned so much about travel from traveling so much. My first travel was always blitzkrieg, just because I was trying to get value for money to see as many places as I could. And now it's very different.
So was mine. And then I decided where I wanted to go, and I spent more time there. I think that's just maturity, though.
Well, that's kind of how I've ended up parking in Split, which is, I got to a point where, again, being very fortunate to have been encouraged to travel early and have the opportunity to travel early. I found a place that kind of just gelled with me, and I felt like I wanted to like dig in a little bit more. And so, now if I only have a week off or 2 weeks off or whatever, I don't want to go on a big trip halfway around the world and only see like a tenth of the things that I want to see. Like I want to just like settle in, get into the vibe, get into the culture. And that's kind of where Split kept drawing me back, and I learned something new every single time I'm here.
Yes. Yep. Yes, because you can go to a place. I've been to Paris so many times, and every single trip was different and awesome. And like I've got lots of places. I've been to New Orleans 3 times, and I loved it each time for totally different reasons. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and I think that, it to your point is that it's maturity, right? Like, and it all kind of ties back together, right? If you're 20 something and you have 2 weeks off and not a lot of money, then blitzkrieg backpacking is great.
Yep.
And then, as you're older and you either get more money or more time or less energy, then these kind of more in-depth kind of jaunts become a little bit more rewarding and, enriching.
And did we just come up
Less
with
energy,
a new term? Like, is blitzkrieg backpacking a thing, or did we just make that up?
Trademark that. Somebody
trademark it.
I've been calling it that for probably since I left the US 20 years ago, because my first trip after, I went to see a friend in Europe, and I flew into London, and then I flew to Amsterdam, went to Den Haag to see his family, and then we drove from Den Haag but I was only there for like 9 days, and it was like and because we went through Berlin, we're like, oh, we're going to use the German word blitzkrieg, and that's how it stuck as the title of blitzkrieg tourism. Yeah. How about I want to talk about change. So you mentioned about change, things have changed with you. Like you've been out of the country, out of America for 16 years permanently.
Yes.
What about you has changed that you are acutely aware of, and other people may even point out as well?
Gosh, so much. I mean, and again, who knows how much of that is just maturity, right? But I definitely think that I'm a lot more self-aware in terms of, it doesn't mean I'm perfect, and it doesn't mean I don't make mistakes and sort of default to some of the behaviors that we've discussed that aren't exactly attractive, but I'm aware of it, right? And I have definitely like moderated my behaviors and sensitivity to other cultures through my awareness and learning about how to operate in the world when you're the guest, really. And I think that does kind of, again, I feel like I'm American bashing, and I really don't mean to be, but for all the reasons that we discussed, like, a lot of Americans don't spend significant amounts of time abroad, and they are the guests, and they have the expectations of a guest in a foreign country, which is different when you are a resident. It's you need to adapt to the way that the country where you choose to live works. And so,
Yep.
you know, being aware of that and moderating yourself, you know, my expectations are different. I'm 100% less materialistic than I was. I mean, when I think back to when I came over, and I don't mean that in an obnoxious way, materialistic, but we have a lot of stuff in America. Like, stuff is
Yep.
cheap and available and easy. And, you know, even the silly thing about the heating or whatever, like, it's just, we are a very big consumer society,
Yep.
and stuff is cheap. Okay, not right now, we have a crisis, but, you know, in terms of how we were brought up, what we consider to be basics are not basics everywhere. So, you
Yep.
know, I live in my flat in London that I've lived in for 16 years is 500 square feet. I love it. I absolutely love it. And people are like, you have a 1-bedroom that's 500 square feet? That's crazy. And I'm like, it's actually all I need, you know?
Yep.
So particularly in terms of US to UK, like, my needs are adjusted. I'm not going to say they're few, but they're adjusted.
I would say needs and expectations, because I think going back to, and I'm not trying to diss on Americans, but Americans have an expectation of things that everything's going to be like it is in America. And that's part of the problem. And I've seen it a lot, to the point where I feel like, you know, I've gone in and intervened in a few situations, because I felt like the Americans, the guest there, and doesn't realize that, you know, that macchiato you just ordered from that Croatian guy in this really nice cafe in London is a proper macchiato. It's not the one you get in Starbucks.
Yes.
Oh my God,
And,
a
like,
long macchiato,
this-
which doesn't even exist. Oh, don't even start.
And but I mean, that is not a rare occurrence. And you know, even when Sonia has pointed out, and I've shared this on social media, where, you know, she was in an airport lounge and this guy was being really loud, and it was clearly an American. Like, everyone knows that the person talking the loudest generally is the American.
Yeah.
Every now and then it's somebody else, but
And
more
I'm
often
very
than not-
loud. So, I mean, you know, again, awareness of it, but
This is also a bit of, this is confirmation bias as well, because I notice this with Australians. Like, I notice Australians, like, when you buy a red car, all you see is red cars. Okay. And so I do
that's
think
a fair
that
point.
you're cringing at it. You're having an emotional reaction to the way people are acting. I mean, sometimes I'm like, don't Australian bash, but I think that's one of the key things about being an expat. You start to see your country from the outside, and you can be critical of it without hating it. You still love it. You just see what's wrong, and that's fine. There was one point I was going to make. I read an article recently about American culture versus European culture, and they called it the postpaid and the prepaid culture, which is interesting with your heating example. So that's prepaid electricity or heating, as opposed to buying it now, paying later. And that Europe is moving, because of banks and stuff like that, to this postpaid culture, and some countries are trying to hold it back. They say it will change the way that people consume. Have you seen that kind of thing?
No, I mean, you know, that example with the heating was in, you know, the early 90s, and since then I have a really, really awesome boiler that I get a big bill for at the end of every month. And, you know, I think prepaid phones used to be a really big thing as well. Like, I remember my first mobile phone contract when I moved over in 2005, you know, you paid, and then if you went over, you topped up, etc. I mean, I agree with your theory, which is that culture did exist, and we are moving more into the postpaid world. Even here, you know, I have a Croatian phone number, and I get billed monthly, you know.
I don't know about it. That's why I'm asking. I just read it and thought, oh, that's an interesting contrast. Is it real?
Yeah, I think it is very real. Like, I think a lot of, you know, the same thing with the phones here is that, you know, it used to be very difficult, or fairly difficult, to come and get like a postpaid service. I mean, obviously there's a degree of commitment that's involved in that, right? So there's an expectation that you're going to be committed for some number of months or whatever. So, but I do think that, you know, in Europe, because, you know, I think in general, money is just dispersed. You only get paid once a month for a starter, which is opposed to the UK, you get paid twice a month. So you know how much money you're going to have for a month. So if you need to limit that. A prepaid situation works so that, you know, if you use all your phone minutes by the third week, I guess, you know, you don't have phone for a week if you can't afford it.
Yeah.
But I do think, you know, I think that I do think that that is kind of an old school thing. I don't see that as much anymore. Like things feel pretty post-paid.
Like you said about the UK and the US coming closer together, maybe.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes I'm convinced the worst of the US is taking over the UK. So my two biggest bugbears about that are American style adverts. Like when I first came to the UK, I actually used to flip through the channels to look at the adverts. Like I remember when I was at university, like there's still some ads that I watched then that were like iconic. And now it's a lot of those, hey, buy now, blah, 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 that stuff that you kind of typically associate with standard American ads. And the other
I think of pharmaceutical ads in America when I think of that. I'm like, do you suffer from oily discharge?
This will kill you.
We don't have that yet, and I hope we never do. Oh my God, that actually is a shocker to me when I go back and like you know, when I go back to the US to visit, and you know, like the 40-minute disclaimer that this thing will probably kill you and it might make your arms fall off, but your doctor will recommend it for you. Well,
sorry, I cut you off, but I mean,
no, the other big reveal there is that my absolute hatred for golf umbrellas, which, you know, in New York pissed me off and in London pisses me off. Like it's not golf umbrellas themselves. Like if you want to use one on the golf course or where there's plenty of space, go for it. But people who have those enormous golf umbrellas on like a super, super narrow, busy city street, like that used to just be a thing in New York and it used to drive me crazy in New York. And now it drives me crazy in London.
Oh, I hate all umbrellas. After living in Seattle, I use it. So in Seattle, if you use an umbrella, that's a sign of weakness and that you're not a local. And so everyone has hoodies. So I just wear raincoats and hoodies everywhere because I can use my hands. And when I see umbrellas, I have this horrible feeling on the inside, like, dude, get out of my way.
Yeah,
so I'm worse than you. I just don't even like umbrellas. We should start a club.
There's a time and place, but yes, the anti-umbrella league.
Yeah.
AUL.
Oh, that's great. Jim, we're coming towards the end. Do you have any questions that you want to ask to wrap up?
Yeah, I was just looking through our list of questions. Back to an earlier topic about, you know, friends and stuff like that. Do you hang mostly with locals or do you just hang with expats?
Where?
So okay, yeah. London and Split.
Truthfully, in Split, mostly expats. There's an incredibly vibrant expat scene here. And actually one of my expat friends has worked really hard to get the digital nomad permit going. And so now, you know, Croatia is even more friendly for people who are working remotely for the year. They've got this permit available. Another one of my friends has a site called Expat in Croatia that basically just helps people come and settle here. And through those two people, I've met a large group of other people who are expats, and there's a lot of expat resources here. So it's easy. They're not all Americans, but mostly expats. Yep. And I do have some local friends. I you know, it's not that I don't.
Sorry, within that, what is infrastructure like in terms of like internet and as well as financial services to support people doing that?
I mean, internet's fine. It's available. It's not, you know, fiber optic or anything like that, but you can get decent enough speeds to do your job. And it, you know, there's plenty of Wi-Fi cafes. And in fact, my one friend, she runs a co-working space that, you know, for people to come in and actually make sure that they have all of the stuff that they need to work there. Yeah. And in terms of finances, you know, there's so many online banks now. I use Starling and Revolut and whatever based on where I am and what currencies I need. But it's pretty easy to navigate the finances these days, as opposed to like having to set up a Croatian bank account. Like I've been coming back and forth for 6 years. I still don't have a legitimate Croatian bank account.
Got it.
So I have leading on from this though, I have a question. How many tax returns do you have to do?
Oh God. I actually just had assessment with KPMG to find out if I have to be a Croatian tax resident, and it's down to counting days for this year. Every year I do 2 tax returns. I do US and UK. It seems, touch wood, it seems like this year, because I've been unemployed and because I haven't spent X number of days in Croatia, that I do not need to be a Croatian tax resident. But it was an interesting exercise because 3 would be just kind of a pain.
Yeah, people don't realize it.
It's awful. That's the one horrible thing about American, is having to file tax. When is the tax year end?
They're offset by 6 months. So just when you finish your American one, you start your Australian one. It's so horrible.
Yeah. So our financial year in the UK is from April 5th.
Yep.
Okay. How random.
There's no alignment between. So you just
calling Citibank and being like, I know that you sent me my tax form for the UK, but I need it to be from the beginning of the year.
Yeah. So what is it in Croatia if you end up
I don't even actually know, to be honest.
You don't know, okay.
I haven't gotten that far yet. I
good
feel
luck.
like it's a year, but
yeah,
I'm doing my best to figure out how to avoid having to do that this year, legally, of course.
Yeah, I know.
Good luck with that.
Thank you.
Damana, should we end with the last 2 questions that are tightly related?
Two-parter.
The 2-part question is, what is your advice for anybody thinking about moving overseas from their home country? And then the second question to add on to that is, why should they do it?
Yeah. I mean, my advice for anybody who's thinking about moving overseas is do it. I mean, do your research, but know that it's going to be nothing like what you think it's going to be. That you can't understand from a book or a blog or anything else, or even your friends' own experiences. If you have friends living in those places, you have no idea what your own experience is going to be, but that's kind of the joy of it. It's it's a personal thing. So go do it. And the flip side, or the second part of your question, is the same, which is go find out, what do you have to lose? Nothing is permanent. If it's something you're not 100% sure of, or if it's something that's out of your control. So for example, if you're moving for a job and you have to go and you're committed for a certain amount of time, try and make the best of it if it's not what you hoped it would be. And if you're going just because you want an adventure, go see if it's for you. What's the worst that can happen? It's not a prison, it's an experience. And if you don't like that experience, go back. But what you can learn from the hard work of making that effort is pretty spectacular. And what you can learn about a place, about yourself, about your own home country, the value is unquantifiable. And the dangers are pretty limited.
That's awesome.
Something that's come up in every other podcast, but I don't think we've talked to you about, is when you left, were you only going to be gone for a year or 2 and then go back, or did you know? Because everyone so far has said, I was only going to be gone for a while, but they've left for so much longer.
Yeah, I mean, look, by the time I had actually gotten a job and been able to move full-time to London, I had already lived in Bristol for a year for my study abroad, gone back again for 6 months on a work visa, and been visiting the UK regularly for all the years in between. So it wasn't like the great unknown. It wasn't like I'm just going to go for 2 months or a year or whatever. I had wanted to move to the UK for a very long time, and the opportunity had finally presented itself. And I didn't put a time on it. I said, look, I'm going to go. I'm going to see what happens. I have a job. It's a definite employment. And, then I just woke up and it was 16 years later.
As you do.
As you do,
Yep.
And, it's funny because I've spent a third of my life in the UK. I've lived in my flat in the UK longer than I have lived in any home in my entire life. And it just happened. It just happened naturally.
Yeah, same here. I've been in this apartment for longer than any other place in my life. 2/5 of my life have been overseas now. So that's awesome. It's pretty extraordinary. So thank you for doing this. This is really great. It's great to catch up with you as well.
So much.
It's absolutely my pleasure. It's so much fun, and I'm sure that we could go on for another hour, but I hope it's interesting to your audience, and it's been super fun for me.
Yeah, and I love that you're a first one who's kind of done America, Europe,